And welcome back once again to the adventures of the Monk and the Monarch. As always, we have me, the Monarch, and my co host, Mildra the Monk.
Hey,
Diving again today a little bit into the world of tabletop gaming, we're going to be talking about the relationship between tabletop RPGs and anime.
now, obviously, for this kind of thing, the weird and wonderful world of the Japanese side of TTRPGs, I'm moving that off to the side because the idea of anime RPG over there is going to be a bit redundant since the majority of designers are going to be using that style anyways.
Now, this is
Or
an interesting one to talk about it also just because there's not really a whole lot of think pieces out there that I was able to find, like, on the relationship between the two, or crossing influences that you'll see.
Fortunately, I have a lengthy experience on it, and maybe one of these days I will write a retrospective on it from my own experiences. But this is obviously encompassing not just games that are using certain IPs, but games that purport to be anime styled in one form or another.
I think the two
Now, as
big
far
ones specifically you'd want to mention is Big Eye Small Mouth is one of the early ones I was ever aware of. And of course the more crunch heavy anima, which has come up a few times.
as far as anime goes, the thing with a lot of them is there was a debate about whether about how to do quote unquote anime style that didn't just begin and end with get a bunch of mangaka to do art. Anime could arguably be in that category, though I'd say it's less of mangaka artists and more of the art style of Wen Yu Lee. But that's a whole other story. I'll get to anime in a bit, but I want to build to that. I'd say if there was any really big early adopter of anime as a medium for TTRPGs, there's always a Pondsmith involved in these kind of things, and this is no exception because there's two games in particular that are relevant to this from the Pondsmith family of games. One of them is Teenagers from Outer Space, which is very blatantly channeling stuff like channeling a lot of Rumiko Takahashi's work, especially Yatsura and Ranma One Half. I cannot stress enough how big Ranma One Half was for the very early first gen anime communities. The other one is Mechton Zeta, which is still one of the best mech RPGs you can get, even if it's been long out of print. There was rumors about a third edition of Mechton, but with the focus more on Shadow Scar and Cyberpunk Red, that's kind of fallen by the wayside. But Big Eyes Small Mouth is the first one that tried to lay claim over anime overall. I think a lot of people, when they think of Big Eyes Small Mouth, they're going to be thinking of second edition at the earliest, not first. First edition was around, and I have a PDF scan of first edition, but it was very rough, and even Mark will tell you that. It was very clear that his big inspiration was Amber Diceless, even though the game wasn't a diceless game.
No, I've never played it. That was one I was familiar with years ago. Likely second edition, I didn't really keep a close eye on it. It always struck me as like a very rules light kind of game.
A lot of these self-proclaimed anime RPGs were very front loaded because the concept was downstream from Universalist games, which means it gets heavily crunchy on character creation and advancement. But when it comes to the die rolling part, that's pretty simple. At the time, it was a aim low system, and in from third edition onwards, it became a roll high system. And if anybody wants details on why that change happened, I covered that in my first interview with Mark McKinnon. But I'd honestly say the big thing that helped Big Eye Small Mouth get on the map was the Sailor Moon RPG, since it was using that same system along with that Black Chancery font that Mac users were obsessed with at the time. The Sailor Moon RPG was fine. It is going to be a little bit out of date because a lot of the seasons that were handled by Pioneer weren't accessible at the time. They were around, they were known about, but but there wasn't an official translation in the mid '90s. Something that has happened is that a lot of games tried to treat anime as this all encompassing almost omni genre.
I think
And
that's one of the reasons, like, stuff like Big Eye, Small Mouth, while it did get a following,
oh,
but
it
still has
it
one.
still has a very dedicated fan.
Yeah. But it never got,
But I
like,
think it's
huge.
that depends on
Like,
who you
well,
ask.
yeah.
I'd say the bigger problem is the fact that when trying to do these multi-genre affairs, there's so many ways that can be taken, and that is a style of game that is always going to have a slightly higher floor because it's going to be putting more demand on the GM. I think this is the reason why something like the Sailor Moon RPG was able to work as well as it did. For starters, it was the only one. It was the only game in town, but also the fact that it wasn't trying to do a bunch of different genres and subgenres at once. That's always been the problem with trying to do a anime RPG. Slight tangent, but it's important to remember the times that these things came out. Like Besm, like very late '80s, early '90s. There wasn't a whole lot of widespread understanding of different genres of anime. It was a case of you get what you can get, and usually that meant a lot of the big names through VHS trading. Sometimes getting those early dubs if you're lucky. The ones from like the early days of Anime Ego or the like that are just a case of grabbing whoever could talk off of the street.
Oh, many a great dub
Not
from that time. I
yeah.
digress.
Not that I'm slagging those early dubs. It was an important stepping stone, and you got to crawl before you can walk.
And there are certainly
But the
some that were
point
actually
is
really good, but yeah.
yeah, not from Anime Ego, I can tell you that. The reason that's important is as time went on, people in the West got a better and better understanding of anime, and thus you start getting more refined concepts. You start to get less and less of the anime as a genre kind of games, and more focus on either specific genres, specific IP, or a specific direction.
Because, yes, it'd be weird
And
to try to run a mecha anime like you would run a Sailor Moon anime.
this whole thing of trying to account for multiple genres and subgenres is an even bigger problem just from a writer perspective because you're only going to have so many pages in the book to work with,
No,
which
I
is
don't
why
recall Big Eye Small Mouth trying to go that broad.
it went pretty broad. And the reason why first edition didn't go very broad. Second edition had a bunch of different supplementary books that covered different genres. You had more darker affairs with Cold Eyes, Dark Hearts. You had its own parody of Pokemon with cute and fuzzy cockfighting seizure monsters. Later having to be retitled. You had the nods to stuff like Gunsmith Cats. You would have some games that some entries that were full on adapting certain IP, like the aforementioned Sailor Moon. There's also one of Ghost Dog of all things, but that's another story, and a spin-off with Hong Kong Action Theater. So there were a bunch of genre books that were tackled.
For the record, if I were to run Gunsmith Cats, I think I might run that in Outgunned. Kind of fits.
That being said, I do think that this is the reason why I've always said that Pondsmith was ahead of his time, because this notion of developing for a specific genre or feel that's what he was leaning towards, and that's what a lot of anime adjacent TTRPGs would lean into with time, mostly because it's going to be easier as a writer to handle that kind of thing than trying to do everything at once. I want to make it clear, I don't dislike Universalist games, but I do think their adherents don't do a good enough job going into the totality, the benefits and the drawbacks of that approach. Because a lot of them will say, "Oh, you can use this to run anything." Technically speaking, that is true. Practically speaking, there are hurdles that you have to get through, and that's why I say Universalist games will always have a higher floor than others.
I think there definitely needs to be some semblance of like grounding and limiting to even a universalist system.
Oh, there is, but
But
it's largely dependent on the GM to establish that,
yeah,
which is why those kind of games are going to put extra work on them. It's just not something that I will particularly slag any one Universalist game for, or Universalist leaning game for doing that, because it's a case of let he who is without sin. Like it's hard for me to single out one GURPS or hero or the like for doing that when this is the problem with every Universalist game. Even one as simple as Savage Worlds is going to have this problem. It's not going to have it as much because it's not as crunchy, but the problem is going to rear its ugly head.
and
The whole thing of easier doesn't necessarily mean easy.
as both of us have had our share of DMing games, things that make the life of the DM harder they're rough because you're putting in a lot more work behind the scenes, like days of prep sometimes.
The other big hurdle that can happen is how much are you going to rely on genre savviness? Because it would be very, very easy to simply say you need to know about this particular anime, but not everybody at the table is going to be that as familiar, depending on what anime you're dealing with. If I'm running, say, Cowboy Bebop, I'm going to have an easier time with that because whether it be directly or indirectly, people are going to know about what Cowboy Bebop is. If
And
I'm running
honestly, all
Sailor
the
Moon,
American influence that a Cowboy Bebop has in its story, that's going to help too.
um, look, if I did a drinking game out of the number of times I've seen a cartoon mimic the Akira slide, I'd be dead. Attention, Western animation devs. If you want to say that you're inspired by anime, do it in something that's more than just using the Akira slide or using a magical girl transformation. A whole lot more than that out there. That's just a pet peeve of mine. But anyway, I'd say one of the other hurdles that can happen is a hurdle that is common when people are trying to adapt an IP into TTRPGs, and that is building it in a way where you're not playing as the cast from the show. This was a problem that I ended up having when I first read that Indiana Jones RPG from TSR, which got roasted back in the day because it was assuming you were going to be playing as the cast from the movies. I don't know whose decision that was, but I hope they got flogged for it. If I'm running a Gundam RPG, I'm making it very clear you're not playing as Amuro Ray or anybody from White Base. This is not a discussion.
I'll say I think that's something like not anime, but the Star Wars RPG did. Like it's specifically the D21. Mechanics
Pretty much all of
aside,
them.
yeah, I haven't played the others, so I can't comment too much on them.
Well, when you say the D21, remember there were
Yeah.
two D21s. There was the revised ones in the early 2000s and the Saga, which is much better, in the late 2000s. If you're talking about a bad one, the revised one in 2002 is the one you're thinking of.
It
But
was the one that basically used the basic skill system you saw in 3.5 D&D, but I'm saying more of the idea of it did a good job at setting it up so, okay, we're not playing main characters. It's our own thing in this Star Wars universe.
that precedent was
Yeah.
set with D6, but something else that did not help matters when it came to this relationship with anime and TTRPGs is as anime started to get more and more exposure in the West, especially in the early 2000s. when you had that licensing arms race that we've talked about in the past, there was a growing number of people within the TTRPG space that was very defensive about the idea of this anime shit getting into their TTRPGs. You combine that with the notion of whether or not something like anime that but was made in the West still counts as anime, which was a lengthy and stupid debate I remember seeing back then. It was stupid then, and it's even dumber in hindsight, because I kept telling people this was going to be inevitable as things would get more and more widespread. Of course, there would also be the embarrassing irony if somebody talked about how much they're not a fan of anime, and it turns out their favorite cartoon is the Batman animated series.
Yeah, because a decent chunk of that was outsourced to Japan.
One of the primary animators was TMS. And truth be told, when you're doing a weekly show, you're going to be doing some outsourcing or getting helper studios.
Unless you're Satoshi Kon on Paranoia Agent, but that's another story. He was crazy.
Yeah, yes, but again, that's like limited series and other qualifiers. But when it came to a lot of that notion, it's what ultimately kept a lot of that from the D20 bubble. I know there was the attempt with Basm D20, but while that one did develop a following, I'm not a big fan of it because it tried to essentially do the fusion dance between the Tristat system and the D20 system, and this is 3.0 era D20 system. Tried to introduce classes of a sort. It wasn't the best execution. I do remember when it got its reincarnation in the form of Anime 5e, which honestly handles the idea a little bit more elegantly. It's only recently that's decided to try and do things besides anime fantasy. And this wasn't the only case of trying to mash two systems together like this. Only certain systems are going to be able to mix together well in that way. And D20 and Tristat are not two of them.
I think one thing worth noting is I can't comment on like the Japanese RPG scene during these time frames. You really weren't seeing like show specific projects for anime here in the West around those times like you might have been over in Japan. As you mentioned, we did have the Sailor Moon one.
Yeah, there was Sailor Moon. If there's anybody who's doing the most adaptation of IPs in this regard, it was the old Guardians of Order, because you had Slayer's D20, which is actually pretty good. Then you had those weird ultimate fan guides for things like Dominion Tank Police or Hellsing or Trigun, which was ultimately a lot of setting fluff. Though there was also a book for Ghost Dog, which, don't get me wrong, Ghost Dog is one of my favorite movies, but who really looked at that and said that was a good spot to role play in? At least with something like Trigun or Hellsing, I'd say there's room to go with, but this was using Gonzo Hellsing, and even then, I think the amount of wiggle room you've got there is going to be limited. And just playing as a soldier in the Hellsing organization, that's not going to be appealing to a lot of people. They could go, why don't I just use Delta Green? And this was the other thing. How mechanically do you carry that idea of playing an anime? Because how do you carry that idea of playing a visual medium? That's not a question that I or anyone else I think is ever going to have a concrete answer for, largely because that's going to be so subjective. But I think it's one of those questions that was more born out of the limited amount of info that we had at the time. I know some will look at certain IPs getting TTRPG adaptations nowadays and say that everybody's getting is like, that's nothing new. Let's not forget, even the original D&D was just them adapting a bunch of stuff that they liked. And obviously that's a vast simplification, but you get my point. I think that when it comes to adapting, it's very much a complicated measure, far more complicated than I think a lot of people give it credit for.
Yeah, because I think we've all seen them try to just take certain properties and jam them into pre-existing systems. 5e is not going to be good for handling a lot of systems I think people have tried to use it for.
This was something that I would have thought we had learned after some of the more infamous experiments in the 2000s. Stuff like Fading Suns and Deadlands' D20 books are high up in the realm of we don't talk about that. Like, you want to get a longtime fan of Fading Suns pissed off, just bring up that you're running Fading Suns D20 and watch his face twist into scorn. Not that I'm speaking from experience on that or anything. No, sir. Admittedly, there are some genres that are going to be easier than others, depending on the system. Would you use a D20 based system to run a slice of life RPG anime? I don't think so. Could you do it? Yes, but you'd have to do so much extra legwork. Is it even worth it? I know a lot of people will try and argue that there's some sort of X factor when it comes to anime that makes it required to do its own thing. But just as an example, what would be stopping someone from using, say, at the time, D20 Modern to run a Ghost in the Shell like campaign? Same for something like, say, Cyberpunk 2020 at the time. I don't know how this started, but there was this mindset that anime was this separate thing that needed to be walled off from the rest of entertainment, or this separate, discrete category, as someone else had put it. And I think that definitely contributed to the problem for a long amount of time. It was certainly a frustration for me because I would go into forums and I would see people do these really good play-by posts, or go into role-play forums and go, these people would take to it like a duck to water to TTRPGs. But because there wasn't a whole lot of options when it came to that concept, I'd either have to make it myself or use something that visually wouldn't carry the same energy to them. That's not as much of a problem nowadays, but that was a problem at the time.
But yeah, like the whole mixing of anime and TTRPGs, it's not something I really saw people even trying to do much of at all, outside of the occasional hearing things about Big Eye, Small Mouth. But
You'd see it a lot more in forum.
I wasn't really up on like the tabletop forums for the longest time. It was mostly just whatever my group was around my area.
I look at that as a consequence of the gatekeeping problem. This is a problem I still see today. I remember Vincent, Vindicated Entertainment, telling me about how people would turn up their nose at his game for being too anime, and he actually he went to a tabletop gaming convention to promote his stuff, but he'd have a much easier time getting anime fans into it when he'd show it at an anime convention. I've talked about this many times. This is an issue of that whole old guard mindset, and anime as this different thing that shouldn't be in the purity of TTRPGs. You can't see it, but I'm doing massive finger quotes with that.
No, don't get me wrong. It's come before. Like, I do think just the term anime itself has its own use as kind of this cultural thing of stuff from Japan, but it's not like it is entirely different in every possible way. Like, as I mentioned earlier, something like Gunsmith Cats, we have Outgunned that would run it. And I don't think anything we've seen from Outgunned was like specifically geared towards something out of Japan. Like, there's plenty of crossover here.
Mm-hmm. And it's something that I've tackled in the past. I remember someone asking me how I've had questions about how I'd run this or that adaptation of IPs, and something I've always done my best to make clear is that first off, depending on what system you're using, it's probably not going to fit. But also, do not sleep on fan works that are doing exactly that. that was what I said. That was what I said in the late 2000s. Nowadays, there's even less excuse.
Yeah.
I mean, you look just all over. You look just all over the place. You'll find plenty of fan games, and I'm certainly not saying that because I'm working on one myself, or rather, have worked on. The text is more or less done, but it is more. It's more to do with the fact that there's, as I've said before, there's a game for just about every genre, subgenre, IP, or whatnot, and anime is certainly no exception. Admittedly, if you're trying to go for an anime that's a little more art house, a little less actiony, you might have a trickier time with that. And worst case scenario, you might have to go with a universalist affair. But even in that, you've got options. There is the full form stuff like what you've got with Big Eye Small Mouth, or you could go something lighter, like say open versatile anime. Especially since with that one, it's another case of only rolling 2d6. So the options there.
Now, other than Big Eye Small Mouth, what were like the times you'd think that like more anime TTRPGs were becoming prominent over here?
Whenever it comes to these kind of things, it's never one entry that just blew everything up. It's always 1,000 cuts.
Yeah.
I think what ended up happening, and this is my crackpot theory on the matter. It started out with just folks focusing on with just because of the lack of a representative in the official space. A lot of folks started going more and more unofficial, started doing more and more in their own stuff and putting it on places like Giant in the Playground or TG or The Forge or 1KM, 1KT.
Typically, I've seen a lot of homebrew content for existing systems to try to get some more stuff from their favorite shows into them.
There is that. Then eventually you see people start to do their own thing entirely. That's just a natural part of the process. And then that slowly simmered over time until we get to the current setup that we're at.
Because I know since doing Valley with you, I've started seeing like all these different weird projects. Like I know there was the Super Sentai one of the fan made renditions of that.
Oh, there's been plenty of that, and all of them are better than the official. I do think the reason an official Super Sentai RPG would become a thing, or rather an official Power Rangers one, was largely the success of that Hyperforce actual play that Hyper RPG did a few years ago.
Yeah, I'm aware there's a huge span of years there. I wasn't really paying too much attention to tabletop, so there's a big gap in my knowledge between Anima and when I started doing Valley with you.
Yeah. And obviously, Anima was a case of a bunch of guys from Spain working with TTRPG artists who had worked on various Japanese projects. When it comes to something like Anima, I think it's important to see that as less of the ultimate anime fantasy TTRPG and more of a over-the-top successor to Rollmaster.
Don't get me wrong.
I think Carlos is outright stated.
Yeah, but I think there is some clear anime influence, even with like the techniques. One of the example techniques in the book is just a Kamehameha.
Oh, that was always going to happen. I'm not saying it's not there. I'm saying that referring to Anima as the anime fantasy RPG would not do the full picture.
I just bring that up as kind of like where my knowledge at that time kind of came to an end of what was going on with that whole scene.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In all fairness, when it comes to Anima, that's had an interesting history because, well, at least with the English translation of it.
Because while it definitely got a fan base, too, it never really blew anything up. Like, it's not what opened the gates to a bunch of shit that come after it, as far as I can tell. certainly has its nice little dedicated following.
It certainly does.
But as far as I can gauge,
Yeah.
it's kind of been like just a slow burn. Like it's just been slowly getting bigger and bigger as time's gone on.
Yeah,
For just people making these fan projects, official releases of anime RPGs.
and it's something that I always said was going to happen. Just by virtue of you're going to have more and more people who had grown up with various anime over the years and were inspired by that to make their own creative work. And
I don't have really any major final thoughts to help wrap this up. But yeah, good
Yep.
place to wrap this up. I think the conclusion here is we both have some pretty high hopes for the future of what anime is going to do in relation to TTRPGs.
mhm.
But yeah, then you can go ahead and then catch us next month when we'll be talking about Masami Obari, since it's been a little bit since we've done a dive into a director. It's nice having an actual schedule for this so I can say what we're doing next month.